This is AOS Shorts. Get better fast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AOS Shorts. Today is another episode in the Masterclass series where I get the fabulous opportunity to talk to top tier tournament gamers from around the world and basically pick their brains on all things list writing and strategy for winning tournaments. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Mr. #SoHotRightNow, Ben Savva, recent winner of the Warhammer Age of Sigmar Grand Tournament Grand Final in the UK and proud member of the South London Legion. How you going, Ben?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah, still riding that high a little bit. It's yeah, I've been very happy, very pleased since. Yeah, still can't believe it really.
Yeah, well, it's certainly been a purple patch for you with doing well at Bobo and then Blackout and then first at Angel Core and first at the GT Final. Certainly riding a wave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm earning that hashtag, I think. and I'm never going to live it down as well. If the weekend was anything to go by, the amount of people shouting that across the halls of Warhammer World, yeah, that's stuck with me now, I think.
Yeah, well, when I posted a tweet out saying that I was going to be speaking to you in a couple of hours, the first 5 replies that I got were just #SoHotRightNow. So, yeah, Rob's done a great job of sticking you with that moniker.
He is, isn't he? Yeah, media mogul, that guy.
He can make or break a man, that man. So great. So thank you so much for coming on. It was great actually catching up when you came down to New Zealand for a brief sojourn earlier in the year. So it's good to talk to you again after that while. So let's kick off. Why don't you just explain a bit about your background in the hobby, where you are, your hobby journey, and then we'll get into the rest of the show.
Okay, yeah. So I think, like most people, I played it when I got into the hobby when I was quite young, sort of around about 8 or 9, and played it solidly then for, like that became my first sort of obsession really. And yeah, I had a lot of different armies and I'd work part-time jobs, even though I was only like 13, to be able to afford to buy a Bloodthirster. And yeah, we had I was lucky enough that my stepdad was a commission painter, so we had a loft conversion where we had a game board set up constantly. Didn't have too many people to play with, to be honest, but I had the space to be able to explore the hobby, and I had a lot of different armies and got really into it. And then I guess the same story as a lot of people. You get into girls and drinking, and then there's a period of 15 years where you're pretending that you're too cool to be a nerd, and and then I kind of got back into it after Age of Sigmar, really. After just as Age of Sigmar dropped, I was living in Greece, and I used to every couple of years kind of go onto the Games Workshop site and see how much advancement there has been in terms of the models, and I'd get really excited and sort of in my head would kind of look through and choose an army that I would play if I was going to start again. And I don't know why, when I was living in Greece, just kind of went onto the site and looked around and saw that Age of Sigmar was dropping, and that was the first time I'd looked in a couple of years, and then just felt like that seemed like the right time to get back into the hobby. I was in a relationship with a girl that I didn't mind letting myself go in front of, like sort of, I didn't mind becoming a full nerd again, and that was it. Yeah, and ever since, well, I mean, I couldn't play any Age of Sigmar in Greece, obviously, but I watched a lot of battle reports, Guerrilla Miniatures, and Frontline Gaming, and some other places while I was out there. And then as soon as I got back, I bought an army, and then and I was hooked again.
So well-worn path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
For many of us.
Yeah, but that's it now, and now I'm back. I'm really, really pleased that I got back into it. It's been a fantastic couple of years playing since, and really enjoying it. It's really good to be back.
It's good to have you back too. So got you on the show to talk about basically your recent tournament success and Daughters of Khaine. But before we sort of dive into the depths of the competitive play, one of the things that I wanted to touch on was your army, because it's an absolutely unique converted piece, and has a fabulous, very distinctive paint scheme. As well as that, I think out of all of the hobbyists I know, you've probably got the most detailed narrative lore backstory to your army out of everybody that I've spoken
untold to. As of yet. Yeah.
It's one of those sort of oral histories not quite written down. But I wondered whether you wanted to sort of give a touch of the flavour of that before we get on to the competitive side of things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, obviously we're here to discuss gaming, and that if I got into the into the lore behind it, I would probably be, that's a whole different conversation. That's probably I could talk about that for an hour or two, but it's, as I say, it's all in my head at the moment. I've never written any of it down, but it's something I just sort of develop as I sit and paint. Like I think about the army and where it's from, and I think about the characters, and I think I've probably a very wild imagination, and I'm also quite an overzealous person, so a little obsessive at times, and so I've got pretty into thinking about these people and, well, these characters, these armies, and the story of the Earthwood, which was something I created right at the beginning before I even bought any models when I was in Greece, because I couldn't do anything in terms of buying models or paintings, so I decided to start developing an idea for a story. And at the time when I was living in Greece, I was out there writing a book. I write as well, and it's another hobby of mine. And so I just sort of, like, as downtime from writing that, I would just sit and think about the story of the Earthwood. And I guess what it is, and at its base, is it's a form of escape, and that's something I've always been interested in, especially in art. I've always saw art as a form of escape, and I've kind of been obsessed my whole life with the idea of loopholes. And I think that's probably why I really got into Warhammer so much, and especially, in particular, list writing is trying to find loopholes. And that's what I've been trying to do, I guess, my whole life in various different forms. And the Earthwood is a place that I escape to. And I guess Warhammer now, the hobby and the community and everything, is an escape from real life, I suppose. And a much sort of more happier and healthier and more productive escape than the usual places that people go to escape real life.
Yeah, I think in terms of ways of detaching yourself from the modern problems, I think creating a world for your miniature army is probably much more healthier than the sort of alcohol and drugs route.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But no,
yeah.
I'm really interested in hearing more, and perhaps we'll save it for one of the creator class pieces on the site.
Yes,
and as you say,
you invited me to do one of those a long time ago, and I'm still getting around to it. It's on somewhere near the top of my to-do list.
Let's talk about list writing and loopholes then. So
Yep.
You've been running the same Daughters list all of this year, or for most of this year since Daughters came out?
Yes. Yep.
And so just to run it down for people at home, it's a Hagnar list with a Slaughter Queen on Cauldron of Blood, with Devoted Disciples, Iron Circlet, and Blessing of Khaine. Morathi with the Shroud of Despair. A Medusa with Shadowstone and the Mindrazor spell. A Hag with Catechism. And then 30 Sisters with Whips and Bucklers. 10 Sisters with Whips and Knives. 30 Witches with Paired Knives. 2 times 5 Heartrenders. And then the Slaughter Troop Battalion, which contains the Slaughter Queen, both Sisters units, and both Heartrenders. So that's the list. So why don't you tell us how you came about that list, how you put it together, what your considerations were, and sort of what your list design process was.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, I think list writing is probably one of my favorite parts of the hobby. I can sit and spend so much time theory crafting, and like I do it with almost every army, which I think is a fantastic way to get to know other armies, is to sit and try and build the most the most competitive lists that you can. So I kind of see, like, list writing is I guess like many crafts, it's like you start with a block of wood, and the craft then is, carving that down into something that's cohesive, something that works. And I think when I first saw that, I committed to Daughters, and I committed to them for the whole year. The moment I saw that video, I shall not be denied, Morathi video. As soon as I saw that, yeah, it was fantastic, and I was hooked. And I had, I'd been saving up all my tips from work, and I was waiting for the army to drop that I wanted. And yeah, I took this, and when I remember initially when seeing the War Scrolls before the book came out, thinking that they didn't look that good. And I think on paper, I think a lot of the Daughters War Scrolls, if taken independently, aren't that great. But the strength of the army is how well it synergizes, and I think that's better than any other army really. There's nothing else really that has the synergies that Daughters have, and so it's the process of the list was how to make the most of those. Designing the list was how to make the most of bringing those synergies together. And I think it's like when you're trying to write a competitive list, which I was for the year. I was at Masters last year, and I was hoping to get there again. I qualified by coming 22nd, and this year I was kind of hoping to qualify by being in the top 16 and not making it there through dropouts. So I was looking to create the most competitive list I could, and I think that is it's quite an exhaustive process really. The things that you have to consider is how the list will perform against all the armies that are competitive in the meta at the moment. How will it? How can it win this? How can it win this or that scenario? What can your army achieve in the first turn? How does that then transition into the middle of the game? Will you have anything alive at the last turn? So like all these and many more are considerations that I think about, even if I'm just writing a Night Haunt list for fun at home. Like I sit and I plan it all out, and it's all in the planning. And I think what makes a good list great is the details, the minutiae. And yeah, that's so it was quite a long process, I think, designing the list. And I have a friend from SLL, sorry, never said that out loud. A friend called Leo from the club, and we are constantly bouncing ideas back and forth. And yeah, we sort of I think I happened upon the Slaughter Troopers being the sort of the core of the army, because I wanted the Heart Renders in there, because their War Scroll on paper looked fantastic, and I definitely wanted those in there. And the other battalion, Cauldron Guard, didn't have Heart Renders, so this was the battalion I chose, and that kind of influenced why there's 2 units of Sisters in the list and not 3 units of Witches, for instance. Which is, I think, now is fantastic, because the Sisters have so much value in game that the Witches don't. So yeah, so then it was. Oh, sorry, question. I'm rambling.
I was just going to very conscious that we've gone through a load of things, so I'm going to try and unpick some of that and tease it out a bit more. So let's just pick up the most recent point about the Slaughter Troop battalion. So you said you've taken the Slaughter Troop battalion because it's got the Heart Renders in it. Heart Renders, I presume you have taken for their excellent flexibility in terms of objective play, the fact that they can come down in any movement phase at your choice, the flexibility with their movement and additional shooting attacks, etc. Was the reason why you wanted that in a battalion because you were wanting a battalion to reduce drops? You still see a low drop army as being valuable within Age of Sigmar 2?
Yeah, absolutely. Although the list was actually designed for AOS 1. The only change that I made in the transition between the 2 editions is that the Slaughter Troop went up 50 points. So I used to run 2 units of 20 Sisters, 20 with knives, 20 with bucklers. And obviously then you get the discount to put them up to 30. So I put one of the 20 up to 30, dropped the other one to 10 to be able to afford the 50. So the whole list was designed really with AOS 1 in mind, and drops were obviously very important then. This was actually in AOS 1, and I felt like it was a high drop list, but Daughters really struggled to get anything less than 5. And And then as it transitioned, I read all the rules for AOS 2. It was too early to see what other people were going to bring, but I still felt like it was very competitive in the second edition. And actually, it turns out I think 5-drop is probably the new 3-drop in AOS 2. There's almost nothing that. In fact, Sylvaneth is the only army I've ever been outdropped by in all the games of AOS 2, which is obviously still 1-drop, and now everybody else sort of sits at the 6 or 7 mark. So this army actually almost always gives me a choice of first turn, which is fantastic because I still think one of my weakest parts of the game is deployment, and so I always try and design lists low drop so that I know before I start deploying that I have the choice of first turn or not. And if I don't, I start to panic and don't know what to do.
It's interesting. It's a good way that you sort of both take into account the rules of the game, plus the meta, plus your own personal predilection and strengths and weaknesses of your own game in making that choice as to how many drops you need effectively for your army. You said when you were talking about the list that the first thing that stood out for you for Daughters was the level of synergies. So it seemed that what you were focusing on was, at the first level, is how can I build as strong an army as possible within the book that I've got, and then test that against, well, what do I need for scenarios, and also what am I going to be facing in terms of armies from other books or mirror matchups, etc. So if we're talking about the synergies, do you want to go through and explain for people at home the synergies which are within this list and the different facets that you were trying to emphasize with those synergies?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as I say, the list hasn't changed much at all. The only few things that have changed is where the items are and who is carrying what prayer. So after 2 or 3 games, I realized just how important Blessing of Khaine was to the army for its survivability. So Blessing of Khaine is the ability that turns your fanatical faith save rerollable. So your 6-up feel no pain or invulnerable save becomes 5-up, and then 5-up from devoted disciples, and then Blessing of Khaine allows you to reroll that. Initially, I used to have Blessing of Khaine on the hag, because I thought splitting the buff then would help you to keep that defensive capabilities alive longer, but realized as soon if you lose the hag or if you lose the Slaughter Queen, 6-up rerollable is nowhere near as good as 5-up. So because the devoted disciples is on the Slaughter Queen, it's better to have the Blessing of Khaine on the Slaughter Queen, and then all that defensive capability is in one model, but it's a 13 wound model with a 4-up save and a 5-up invulnerable, and then obviously you can cast Blessing of Khaine on itself if you really want it to survive. And then because of the importance of that spell, I used to run on the Slaughter Queen I can't remember the name of it now, but the item that allows you to choose an additional prayer from the Prayer of Khaine's book, and I used to run Sacrament of Blood, which is the prayer that allows you to advance forward by 1 turn on the Blood Rights table, which is the Daughters' sort of consecutive stacking ones, which is great, and it's really, really good in Hagnar because from turn 3 onwards, instead of re-rolling 1s to hit, Hagnar allows you to re-roll all hits. But after playing, again, maybe like 10 or 12 games of that, I realized the only turn that's really very useful is turn 2, so that you can get whatever unit that you've put all the buffs on, re-rolling all hits from turn 2. Turn 1, all it does is allows you to re-roll 1s of run and 1s of charge. So, very rarely you're making charges with this list in the first turn anyway. And then in turn 2, the only time that prayer is useful, if you roll a 2, then you've wasted a whole prayer. And so I encircle it, which allows you to re-roll 1s on your prayers, is much, much better on the Slaughter Queen, because Blessing of Khaine is such an important role. Like seeing that at the beginning of the turn, especially if you take first turn and are hoping to get the buffs on one unit so that you can, eat an alpha strike, or so that you can get into a really defensive position and just have a unit sit there and stay there probably or quite easily, even if you get double turned. If you roll that dice and see, well, if you see a 1 or a 2 come up, that changes your whole plan and can ruin your whole plan almost. And so at least having the insurance there against rolling that 1, so you get another chance at it, is really, really key. And then another thing that the battalion allows you to have is an extra artifact. And this is it's becoming less and less important, I think, Mind Razor, because of the amount of death that are in the meta at the moment, and even like there's still demons, there's still Seraphons, so anything with bravery 10 and ignoring -1 rends mean that spell is almost useless, really. But when I first started designing the list, that spell was what the whole list was built around, and getting that spell off on the unit of witches or wherever you wanted to put it was so important that Shadowstone was the most reliable way that I could get that spell off. You could put the spell on Morathi, which obviously I have in the army, and it gives her +1 to cast, which Shadowstone does. But then Shadowstone also allows you to re-roll 1s on your casting. So I don't think there's a more reliable way to get Mind Razor off than having it on the Medusa with Shadowstone. And so in all the lists I've ever wrote for Daughters, Medusa and Shadowstone is in every single one of them. And that might change going forward now because, as I say, it's not as important anymore, or it's not as useful anymore. But yeah, so that probably the thing that I keep the battalion the most for. It has, the ability to retreat and charge is fantastic, especially for late game and stealing objectives. But at the moment, the main reason that I have it is still for the second artifact, which is, really, really key for keeping those buffs up, keeping those synergies running.
There's one of the things that stood out for me in the list was you go, right, here are the things which I really need to get off. In order for my synergies to work, I need Blessing of Khaine. In your AOS 1 and pre-death sort of, you got Mind Razor in there as well. And you then take the step of going, well, I really need these to work, so how am I going to maximize that? I'm going to take Iron Circlet and I'm going to take Shadowstone, because there's no point having a buff or combination of synergies which you're reliant on chance. So you've got to try and remove as much of that chance as possible. And both of those artifacts allow you to reduce the chances that you're going to be stuck without the buffs that you need, or the synergies that you need for your list to work.
Yeah, and that's also why I choose Shroud of Despair on Morathi as well, which I haven't really seen many other people using, but I really, really like it, which allows you to -1 to an enemy unit's bravery on a cast of 4 up, but if you cast it on an 8 up, which is obviously 7 with Morathi, if you're casting it while she's still in hierarchical form, and that allows you to -D3 from the bravery. So it does give you the chance to get Mind Razor off even against death or demons, because if you can get them to a 7, your witches are natural bravery 7 but +1 for the avatar, so then you can beat them. And it hasn't happened often, but they go through skeletons very, very quickly if you can get that -3 bravery off it.
I'm sure they do.
They go through anything.
Yeah,
really, but
yeah, that's another good example of you going, well, right, we've got this one mechanic which turns on Mind Razor and a comparison of bravery between your witch elves or your sisters and the opponent's unit, and you've tried to maximize or stack those odds with Shroud of Despair and the Cauldron of Blood, which will presumably be close enough in most circumstances to be giving your witch elves a plus to their bravery as well to skew the odds in your favor,
and a plus to their attack as well. So it's both those abilities are within 7 inches, as is Devoted Disciples. So the bravery, the extra bravery, the extra attack, and the extra the 5 up pain save is all 7 inches away from the cauldron. So you're definitely stringing out back to the cauldron for those 3.
Yeah, so why don't we talk? We've talked quite a bit about the defensive synergies. So do you want to talk about the offensive synergies which are sitting in the list, and just the sheer amount of damage that you can put out with those witches?
Yep. Well, it's I think the main strength to Daughter's army, and not this list, I think to any Daughter's army as a whole, is that the defensive buffs are completely transferable, so that you can put them onto any unit you want, and it is turning that unit then from, or if in case of the witches, they're a blender against anything with, low save, or even anything with, like an ethereal ethereal zombie dragon. They're still going to probably kill it because of weight of numbers. But yeah, the main power is that you can put those buffs wherever you want. So it even turns, like a Medusa into a killing machine. I've had the Medusa with all those buffs on, charge into a unit of 40 Arcanauts and kill 17 of them, and then take another like 12 or 13 off with bravery, which is just insane. Yeah. And
I can just imagine the look on the other person's face as this single
yeah.
model goes in and takes out.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
40
I
men.
mean, they're all ablative wounds in a unit of 40 Arcanauts anyway, so he's still got his high sky hooks left, but still, that's
Yeah.
getting much closer to the meat of that. But yeah, and then I mean, I don't know. I very rarely put them on the cauldron. I know from when I have done that the cauldron becomes an absolute killing machine. I think in some ways she's probably even better. It's even better to put the buffs on her than the witches, and obviously that depends who you're playing. But she has two swords of her own that are -1 damage and -1 rend anyway, so they go to -2. The Avatar is -2 rend on the War Scrolls. He goes to -3. So if you're fighting anything like I was fighting in the last game of the GT tournament against Gary, my cauldron is right next to a big unit of Sequiturs. The witches were over the other side fighting the Evocators. So in the third turn, I put all the buffs onto the cauldron, and yeah, as you can see, she went through a unit of 20 Sequiturs in, I think it was 3 rounds of combat, with little help from Morathi at the beginning, but she basically did it on her own. So that's where the strength lies, is that you can put the buffs all onto the witches on one side, take out one flank, and then put the buffs onto the other side, onto the sisters, and take out that flank, or put it in onto your cauldron and take out a big monster or a heavily armored unit. And yeah, I really, really do think that is, that's the key to the army, is being able to put those wherever you want, because it allows you so much flexibility then, and it allows you to adapt to your opponent, or to react to your opponent. If they're all heavily armored, then you put the buffs on the cauldron and you send that forward. Although I very rarely send that forward because it's too important for the defensive play. But yeah, so the defensive buffs are Mind Razor, which gives an additional -1 rend to the unit, and then if you're higher bravery, it does double. It's not double damages; it does 1 extra damage.
1 extra damage.
Yep, and then Catechism, which I always have on my hag, which is always very, very close to the cauldron and a unit as well, because she has Witch Brew, which is obviously immune to battle shock and reroll all wounds to a unit within 3. And if she's within 3 of a unit, then she's getting Lookout Sir, so she's -1 to hit. She's a 4 up save because she's near the cauldron, and she's a 5 invulnerable, so she's quite a difficult 5 wound character to kill. And then my hag also has Catechism, which any hits that you roll become 2 hits. So you don't have to roll again for the attack, they just automatically become 2 hits. And then, yeah, so the combination of Witch Brew and Catechism and Mind Razor are the 3 offensive buffs. And yeah, you can kind of put them wherever you want, as long as you make sure everything is in range, which is one of the sort of real finesse aspects of the army. Is there's so many buffs, and they're so dependent on having them in the right places at the right times, that if you not within range of those, or if, for instance, like a slaughter priest casts his Get Over Here and pulls your unit away from 7 inches of the cauldron, which is what Ruspiel did to me in game 5. It's a really clever move. Then the army starts to melt. You really, really see how not weak, but how much easier it is to kill, and how much less damage it does itself once you break those synergies apart. So it's not. I think a lot of people think that the army is just pick up and play and just run forward and just smash things. But there's a lot of nuance to that in terms of the making sure everything's within all those ranges. Yeah, because that's where all of the power lies, is stacking the defensive debuffs or stacking the offensive debuffs. and also then putting them in the right places. Like it's tempting sometimes to just put everything all onto one unit so that they become the hammer and the anvil. But often it's better to to spread them out, to have a hammer and an anvil where needed.
Yeah, there's on the first point, the sort of the flexibility of the buffs is impressive. It's the fact that you're not tied to any particular units with particular narrow keywords or particular limited targets. As you say, the flexibility to basically pick any of the units in your army to receive the buffs is really, really handy. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the sort of last point that you were getting with how the army plays and the difficulty in making sure that you keep your units within the ranges that they need to be. So how do you find that plays with the sort of range of scenarios and battle plans that we now have in AOS 2, where you're often going to have to get or project force into 2 or 3 different parts of the battlefield at various times? How do you go about making the most of scenarios and battle plans with this army?
So I think any of the scenarios that are sort of fought over, like 3 spread out in your deployment zone or 6 across the whole game is quite difficult for Daughters because you don't have the option of splitting up really. Like the army can't really fight independently. There's nothing in there that like yes, you can send a unit of witches off with all the buffs and send them out of range and go and kill something. But then if they're not in range the next turn, they're probably just going to melt, especially if it's your turn again and they're out of range of casting all the spells and they've got nothing on them, then they're just gonna die the next turn. So you kind of have to make sacrifices. Like if it's, for instance, if it's better part of Valor, I normally set up with the 2 big units of 30 and the buff station sort of parked behind them, and then on the other one, I just on the third objective, I'll just leave 10 units of sisters and just let them claim the objective, and then just keep moving them back, or just sort of deploy 6 inches onto the board so they're just within range of the objective, so it gives a longer charge if anyone wants to try and come and get them, and then just move them back and just hopefully then sweep round and sort of take out whatever's coming to steal that less well guarded objective. But yeah, I think that's one of the weaknesses of the army in general is that it has to all fight within a certain distance of each other, and then like sort of when you're stringing out 10 or 12 witches back to your cauldron. I know that this kind of really triggers people, the sort of conga lines, but I'm a big fan of them. I really like them, and I think it's a choice then that you're making, because like 10 or 12 witches is 40 to 48 attacks that are -1 rend, potentially 2 damage, hitting on 3s, re-rolling all hits, hitting on 4s, wounded on 4s, re-rolling all wounds. That's a lot of damage that you've decided not to throw into the enemy to trail back to the cauldron, so that you are getting that extra attack, the extra bravery, and the extra save. So yeah, I think I've kind of gone a bit off tangent here, but
No, you haven't. You've covered the points well. The couple of things I was going to pick up on was the a lot of the scenarios that we've got in AOS 2, you've got that sort of risk reward balance of going, well, am I going for the home objective worth 4 points, or am I gonna just go, well, right, I'm gonna keep my home objective, I'm gonna contest the middle sort of 2-point objectives or whatever, and then I'm going to keep an eye on the numbers, and if I get an opportunity to go for 4, I will. Otherwise, I'm just going to try and make sure that I get my nose in front, and then sort of keep my nose in front through the rest of the game. So that seems something that would certainly work well for Daughters. If you're going to be keeping your army in a bubble, is you're going to go, right, well, actually, I'm going to be smart about which objectives I'm going to contest. I'm not going to try and fight everything. I'm just going to make sure that I'm 1 point ahead at the end of the game to get the major victory. So in terms of Daughters, do you see how you play this army as you're playing a 5-turn game, or do you it's obviously not an Alpha Strike list. It's not you going in first turn trying to smash everything off the
No,
table.
not at all.
So sort of how do you play it in terms of the pace of the army? Like, are you doing all your work in turn 3? Are you holding on for late game fourth and fifth turn? How does the army play that way?
Yeah, so it it is well, this list is or the way I play it is very defensively. I am very aware of how many dice this list rolls and how long it takes to roll those dice, and so it's not that I'm not planning to get to the fifth turn. It's just that I think the game is usually over by the fifth turn because of the way you play it. I normally play very, very defensive in the first turn, maybe even second turn, because when you do get that when you do go in and you make those big hits, it's better to be doing it in turn 3 when you're re-rolling all your hits as well. And so that does kind of shave a little bit off of, the playing time is by just sort of advancing forward very slowly, making sure that you're claiming the objectives that you can and being defensive as you can about that. And I think in a lot of these scenarios now, it is a case of if you can get up even by a point, or if you can get up by 3 points in that first turn with a list like this, you can quite easily defend that 3 point lead. Obviously, the newer scenarios that objectives are jumping around, and there's there's a little bit more randomness to it. But daughters have the pace to be able to move across the board quickly if they need to be somewhere else. So yeah, I don't think it is a list that will always get to the fifth turn. But that's because, as I say, it often just wins before then anyway. Because maybe you've sat back for 2 turns and you've waited until you've got all the offensive buffs available, and then often you can wipe someone in turn 3 if you've been chipping away at them in turns 1 to 2. Sometimes, depending on the scenario, if you're much closer together, then often you can have already done significant damage to their army, so that they can't come back from then anyway. So I don't think it's an army that needs to get to turn 5, although it can get there when if you need to. If, for instance, in my game against Tony at the weekend, it was duality, and I had Morathi on one objective and Cauldron on the other, and the Cauldron died in the first turn, so I knew I had to get Morathi all the way to the end to win that. And so my third and fourth and fifth turns were much, much shorter, because all it was about is just keeping Morathi alive. It doesn't matter about killing anything else, or not that I had much else left to work with. But yeah, so and it's the Daughters is also an army that gets better as the game goes on, because of their blood rights table, and they're re-rolling ones then to wound in the fourth turn across the whole army, and that's for shooting and everything. And then in the fifth turn, you re-roll in saves. So it does benefit you to get later on into the game. So then if you do play those first 2 turns kind of cagey and get through them much quicker, then it benefits you then in the late game.
Interesting. I was going to pick up there on Morathi. How do you play Morathi in the list? What role does Morathi tend to take?
Okay, so I think, like, in theory, the reason Marathi was in the lists is because, and what her main strength is, I think, is the flexibility that she offers. And what I mean by that is that how that she can sort of react or adapt to the opponent and play a role that the rest of the army can't play. So I think some of the most powerful abilities in Age of Sigmar for me are abilities like the Sequitors. I don't know the name of it, but the Sequitors ability that allows them to either reroll hits or to reroll saves, because you can choose then, depending on who you're fighting, which one's going to be more valuable. I think abilities like Alariel's Summon, which is essentially a sideboard that allows you to choose what you bring down depending on scenario or depending on opponent. And then, like the Dreadwood as well, like with the 3 abilities at the beginning of the game, that allows you to choose then depending on what you're facing across the board. Anything that allows, and the Battle Mage was one as well. Until they FAQ'd her, I used to run a Battle Mage in my old army, because I loved choosing the different spell at the beginning of the game, depending on who you were playing. And anything that allows you to react then to what's across on the other side of the board is just so strong. And I think that's Morathi's key strength. Having said that, I think for so long now. I think I've played 38 or 40 games with this exact list, with only changing, as I said, the sort of the prayers and the items. And I think in the majority of those games, I've kept Morathi small because I like because Shroud of Despair is obviously something I put in to help Mind Razor off. She's getting +1 to cast that at a 36-inch range. I'm often keeping her in small form there so that she can get that spell off, so that she can, especially when she's in the realms, that she can provide other support in other ways at 36 inches. She's -1 to hit, -2 if she's near a unit. If she's by the cauldron, she's kind of hard to kill, so it's hard to do those wounds to her, especially as she's sitting behind a wall of witches and sisters. But this weekend, actually, just because of the opponents that I had, and the match and the scenarios that we were playing, I actually had to play a lot more offensive with her. And it was the game against Nick Thompson from WS10, where he was playing Daughters also, and Unit 40 Snakes. That and it was a knife to the heart in Ulgu, so I knew that I could, when the time was right, I could teleport a whole unit of 30 witches from 6 inches of my board edge to 6 inches of his. But I knew that I had to try and slow him down and stop him from getting to me. So I just threw Morathi forward, hoping to just tie him up. And because I knew the buffs weren't going to be useful on anyone else, I decided to put them on to Morathi, which I've only done probably in 1 or 2 other games before, and it didn't come to much. But then her Alpha Strike then against those snakes, I think she killed 9 or 10 of them. And I forgot stupidly I put catechism on the witches and rolled a 6 on her envenomed tail attack, which would have meant that I got 2 attacks through there. And so then on 3s to wound, she would have done automatically gone through their armor because she was -3 rend, and she would have done 7 damage apiece. So she would have done 14 damage with just that 1 attack. And we were both just like amazed. Me and Nick would, we kind of stepped back and we were laughing and just like, wow, like I didn't realize that she could do that. And he was like, yeah, I've never done that with her before. He said he'd never put the buffs on her at all. And we both kind of said, I'm going to do that for the rest of the tournament. And we both did it in our next game. And I can't remember who it was he played, but he said he sent it forward, buffed up, and she smashed up a unit. And then in the second game, I played Russ Veal and sent her forward first turn into a unit of not Wrathmongers, Skull Reapers, and killed 9 of them, I think, in the first turn as well, or 7 of them. Did like 25 wounds to a 30 wound unit. And so, yeah, and so finally, actually after just keeping her in small form for so long, I ended up using her for her strengths and weaknesses, or her strengths, which is, just adapting to the opponent. And actually in the second game, I played, that was in Garan, which is great for Morathi because she has 1 extra wound, and which means she's guaranteed to survive 1 turn longer in combat. But what I did with her there is transformed her in the first turn, mirror pulled her, which allows her to teleport 9 inches away from the enemy and still move. Then she's right up. I was playing Andy, who was playing Nighthaunt, and he'd left a conveniently Morathi base-sized hole in his army where she could charge in and tag 7 of his units. And he's Nighthaunt, so they can't do anything. They can't. I think a Bladegeist can retreat and run actually, but I killed 9 of those with Morathi, so there was only 1 left. And then in his turn, she just has to move. All he can do is just either sit in combat with Morathi or retreat, and he chose to retreat with 7 of his units, which means 7 of his units are not moving forward then and charging. So my army's just sat there, and if I win the turn, then I'm just going to give that to him because he hasn't done anything his first turn, and then he's wasted his double by having his first turn in his second turn, and that's all just from Morathi running in and charging and tanking things, or forcing them to retreat. So I think, that's her real strength, and admittedly, I think I probably have been using her wrong in quite a few games up until now. Sometimes it is the right choice to keep her in hierarchical form, because depending on especially if you're in the realms, like those spells are often more powerful or have more of an impact on the game than just transforming her up and fighting. And she often does whiff. Her attacks are 3s and 3s, and they go down pretty quickly as she takes hits. So she's not there for her damage output really. But I think she just adds so much. As I say, the word flexibility so many times now in this little bit, but that's her strength, I think.
Yeah, that's so important. It's like just been sitting here listening, and it's almost as if you are talking about two very different characters, which is a perfect
Mm,
reflection of the dual model Morathi that we now have.
yeah, absolutely.
And you've got two completely different ways that you can play. If you want a strong supporting caster that's going to be hard to take down and can maximize the realm rules and use the spells and do all of that, you can. And if you need a super strong tanky unit, which is going to disrupt your enemy's battle lines and hold them up for a turn or two, she's invaluable at that. I remember just in our little 1250 point game in Auckland,
Mm,
you thrown across the board first turn and holding up my unit of six sides for forever.
exactly, yeah.
Um,
And yeah,
so yeah,
at 1250
that
points, that's invaluable, really, isn't it?
yeah, brilliant. Anyone that brings Morathi or Alariel at 1250 points needs to.
Yeah.
There's a
I
special
still think
place
that list is
reserved.
unbeatable. Yeah, I'm going to take it to I'm going to take it to the Blood and Glory Vanguard event, which is 1,200. So it can't be exactly what I played against you, but on paper, I still think that that list is close to unbeatable. I think maybe only a hand of dust from Nagash, if anyone brings Nagash in 1,200 points, is the only army I can think that can beat it. Like that list is at that points value. I think is I don't know. I genuinely think it's unbeatable. It's so brutal.
Yeah, it
But
was.
yeah, we'll see.
So we sort of touched on Morathi, and we've gone through a lot about the way you play the army. How do you find your opponents play to try and beat you and your list? Do you find that they try to alpha strike? Are they trying to break the synergies by targeting the cauldron or targeting the hag? How do you find your opponents play against it?
I think more recently, I think all of my games from Angel Core and from the GT tournament, I would say one at each. There was one at Angel Core that was, it was a very easy game, and there was one at GT Finals, which was just a very easy game that was always going to win from the start and didn't pose any challenges. But every single other game I played in out of those 11, so 9 of those games were really, really, really difficult games. Involved a lot of head scratching and outmaneuvering, and they were really, really nuanced. And I think that the way that people have started to play against them now seems more just focusing on the objectives and ignoring the army as best you can, which I think is probably the best strategy against it because like yeah, sometimes people will try an alpha, but if I know that's coming, then I'll just set up the unit of the big unit of 30 sisters, and as I did against Gary, and everything else inside the bubble, and I know because as we've discussed, the strength of the army is in transferable buffs. Losing one unit doesn't matter at all. And even in 2 of the games, one which I lost 21 sisters to Steel of Rain against Jimbo 9 Jimbo. Um, and then in the first game at the GT final against Carl Martin, he put a Eternal Blades on a unit of Rippers. So unit of Rippers doing their infinite attacks or doing their countless number of attacks at 2 damage each, easily wiped out the witches. And actually, that was the first time any Alpha Strikers ever wiped out the whole unit. So even without the 30 witches, you can still come back and you can still win the game. But what I think what the opponents are doing now is just playing the objectives way more. And I mean, that's just from my impression. I don't know. They might have had different plans. They might have tried to come forward and to kill, or they might have tried to break down the buffs. But it's not an easy thing to do. Like even the characters, even the small 5-wound character like the Hag is still difficult to kill. And I think in the 40 games I played with this list, I've probably only lost my Hag 3 times. I've probably lost my Cauldron maybe once. Probably lost Morathi only. Oh, Morathi dies more actually because she transforms up and goes and fights things. But I've lost Morathi in hierarchical form probably only once as well. So it's not easy to break down the buffs. It's not easy to alpha strike, and it's not and you can't just sit back and do nothing against it. So I think the best thing to do is to just play the objectives, and that's what people have been doing, and that's what's been leading games to go right down to the wire. And I think out of those 11 games I've played in the last 2 tournaments, as I say, I think probably 7 of those are coming down to the very last turn and are really, really in the balance. And I think for anyone, like, that's my best advice for anyone playing against Daughters, is to just play the objectives. And I think this list is it's designed like many of my other lists. I've played Cunning Rook before, and I played a Sky list that was all pop up, big units of 30 acolytes. And what I like to do is play a sort of like a distraction or diversion tactic, in that you pose so many threats on the board that people are so scared. This is how it was to start with anyway. When I started playing with Daughters, people are so scared about 30 witches that they pile everything in there, or they're so scared about Morathi that they put too much attention into trying to do those 3 wounds in the first turn. And because you're distracting people with really horrible threats like Gunning Rooks or 30 Sky Acolytes popping up off the board, people often forget about the objectives. And I think that's how I tend to win a lot of my games. When I go into the battle, the first thing I'm thinking about at the beginning of every turn is, how do I score the objectives this turn? And that is how everybody should be playing, really. Is the objectives is what's the most important thing in the game. And it's surprising still how many people don't play objectives. But yeah, if I have any advice for anyone coming up against Daughters, it's just think about the scenario and think about how you win the scenario. And obviously you can't just ignore the threat of 30 witches or a buffed up cauldron, but how do you reduce that threat while still going forward and scoring points?
That's all super solid advice, and that point you make about you writing a list which presents multiple threats, so you give a difficult decision to your opponent, because you may find that your opponent puts the extra shooting and ranged attacks into Morathi to try and get 3 wounds off, and then by the time the next turn comes around, they've got witches right up in their face, and so they go, "Oh, we've now got to deal with that threat," and so they sort of split their fire. They don't take out one threat. They sort of deal with one threat a little bit before they move on to the next, and they haven't neutered either of them, and they haven't really attacked the scenarios, and they're just behind the game.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and while they're trying to figure all that out, I'm always on the scenarios, always scoring points, and going ahead, or at least or sometimes if you give them the first turn, then I'm figuring out how to get that objective back as quick as possible. So that's where I'll put all of my, like if there's a Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon over there, and there's a unit of 20 skeletons on the objectives, I'm putting all my buffs onto the unit that are going into the skeletons to make sure that they die, so that I claim the objective, and then the Zombie Dragon, I'll just take his charge, or I'll deal with him later. But if he's not scoring, if obviously it's a hero. If it's a hero objective and the Zombie Dragon scoring, then that's the one I'm taking out. I don't care about the unit of 40 skeletons that are bearing down on my witches, which they're obviously going to get blended by. Like always, put those buffs where they're going to be most helpful in winning you the scenario.
So we sort of dealt with how opponents play you. What are you most worried about? If you're looking across the table, what's the army that you don't want to see across the table from you?
So at the very early days of, well, all through playing this army in AOS 1, and thinking about the armies then, even the sort of, the big horrible names from AOS 1, like Vanguard Wing or Change Host or Clown Car, I think that this list could have. I didn't actually get to play any of those lists, but I thought about them all a lot during the list writing process, and I think it could have easily beat all of them. And going then into AOS 2, that sort of, obviously it was too soon to know what was going to pop up, but from very early impressions, after playing at Bobo and Blackout, I said often to people when they said, what's your bad matchup? I don't think there is one. I think that this list doesn't have a bad matchup, because it's so flexible, and especially now because I know it so well. Having played like 40 games with it, there's nothing like the experience of just playing one list over and over again, for making you just so confident about what you're playing against, because you know exactly what your army can do, its strengths and its weaknesses. Having said all that, I'm now, since playing at Angel Court and the GT finals, Nagash lists, and not so much death lists in general. I think specifically Nagash lists is a bad matchup for Daughters, and I think a bad matchup for almost anyone. Like I played Ben Murphy at Angel Core and Tony Moore at the GT final, both really really good players as well, which definitely doesn't help. But in terms of their list, I scored 0 kill points against both of them. And I think Tony said that I played him in game 3 and he hadn't dropped a single kill point all tournament. And I think for Daughters, who are often tabling, almost any army they can table, if your goal is to table the other army, and not play objectives, you could probably do that with most armies by turn 3. And so for Daughters to score 0 kill points against them twice and that's the first 2 games of Age of Sigmar I've ever played where I've scored 0 kill points. And that I think that Nagash lists they're the best lists in the game right now, in my opinion. I think they're much better than Daughters lists, and I think that everybody should be way more afraid of the Nagash armies than they are of Daughters. I think they're just so hard to shift, and even if you can get through all those bodies, they'll just bring them back. And Nagash is just such a threat that with all of the lack of shooting in the meta now, he's much harder to kill or even get to. So I think that's the only lists that I'm really really that scared about coming up against, I think.
That's really interesting. So it's an interesting reflection on how the meta and armies shift. So we see a reduction in shooting. We see the sort of abandonment of the clown car, so therefore Nagash has lost his main counter. And so not only has Nagash got a new book and the realm rules and the other stuff from AOS2 that has given a benefit to that army, but they've also lost their major threat. So I expect to see a lot more Nagash builds running around the tables.
I think we're going to see. Sorry.
I was just going to say the other thing I noticed looking at the GT finals results was that although you took out 6 games, your kill points was much lower than many of the other lists up around the top, which surprised me for a Daughters of Khaine army. But perhaps surprises me less now that you've explained how you have played the army and the particular matchups that you faced at that final.
Yeah, I mean that's the same with my Cunning Rook as well. That you kind of put these armies down across from people, and they've heard all the horror stories of how many dice they're doing, how much damage they're doing, and are scared of getting tabled. But that's just not the way I play. When I took Cunning Rook to the Masters and to Heat 1 this year, I think I scored less than 2,000 kill points in both tournaments. Like 2,000, less than 2,000 in one, less than 2,000 in the other, but also lost less than 2,000 across the whole game. And the Masters is 6 games, so I scored less than 2,000 kill points and lost less than 2,000 kill points out of a possible 12,000. That's the way I play the game. I play the objectives. I don't play to table my opponent. Often, you put Daughters of Khaine down and people are like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I'm just going to get slaughtered in a couple of turns. But that's not how I play. So, often my games are almost always going down to like 2.5 hours, and I'm playing the objectives and they're playing the objectives. So they're often really good games, I think, or at least they are from my point anyway. But I don't know if my opponents feel the same, but at least I do give them a game, like it's not just running forward and shooting everything off, which I'm sure the army could do. And, the same for Cunning Rook as well. It could have easily done that. It has the output to do that. But that's just not the way I enjoy playing, I think that's, I didn't really play much fantasy apart from when I was young, but that seems like like something they've carried over from there is just tabling your opponent, scoring kill points. But, I like to play the nuanced game and, play objectives. And I think it just makes a bit more for an engaging game as a whole then as well.
Oh, it certainly does. And the sort of interplay, and just thinking back to your game against Gary and the fight between you two over those objectives in the last few turns, and the balance and the sort of mental maths about what you were each going to need to do. Gary to try and preserve his lead, and you to try and claw back that lead as much as you could. Certainly just adds up.
So much fun.
whole new thing to the game. Um, Conscious of time ticking on, and you
Yeah,
needing to
sorry,
get
yeah, I
on
do
with
have a
your day.
tendency to ramble.
No,
No.
it's all good stuff, and look, I wouldn't describe it as rambling at all. Um, I think I was going to talk on the grand tournament about sort of key strategic decisions and things like that, but I think we've covered quite a bit of that in the sort of illustrative examples that you've given of your games with Tony and Russ and Gary and Nick and Andy through that. So we might move past that, unless there was anything particular that you wanted to highlight, which you haven't sort of touched on so far.
Um, no, I think I've covered it all. I covered like a little bit of each game. Obviously, I could go in and talk about every single game for quite a while,
Yeah,
but
and I
yeah,
think I
there's
think
time there's time going. That
I think
Yep,
Rob will be
sorry, carry
keen
on.
to do the full rundown with you of your
Yeah,
um,
actually, yeah, that save
games.
something save something for him. Yeah.
So the one thing I did want to touch on was realms. So
hmm
since Malign Sorcery, there's been a massive amount of discussion within the community about realms and how realms should be taken into account in competitive match play. And do we have
hmm
artifacts but not spells? Do we have all the realms? Do we pre-select realms in one particular feature? So there's been a lot of debate about it. So I'd be interested in your views on um, realms, whether or not you felt they impacted the grand tournament, whether you're taking them into account in your list design. This list obviously having been largely designed before realms were a thing. Um,
hmm
so, sort of, how do you feel about realms in list design, and how did they impact your games at the GT final?
Yeah, I mean, I think it did make an impact slightly because as I say, I've been probably not using Morathi as well as I could have been in games leading up to this. I've been theory crafting a lot of replacements for her, what I'd put into the army, and if it wasn't for the GT final and also Blood and Glory both being set in the realms, where I think Morathi is, just have a lot of value there, then I probably would have dropped her. So that definitely, yeah, it definitely made me think about keeping her because of that. Um, but yeah, I think. Sorry, I did forget the rest of the question then. Started
Well, that's what
talking.
happens when I give you a rambling question, which is in multiple parts.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly. Yeah.
very poor cross-examination technique. I'd have my knuckles wrapped if I tried that in a high court. Um, so, so the second part of the question was um, how they impacted your games in the GT final. So you sort of talked about the impact on list design, but in terms of
Yep.
on the tabletop, how did the realms come into play?
So I think for me really that I don't think they made too much of a difference. Obviously there was that trick with Marathi mirror pooling behind the lines and slowing down that Nighthorn army, and then in the game against Nick I did eventually in the third turn teleport a unit of 30 witches to his backline and charged onto his objective, outnumbered him and won the game there. But I think that game would have, and well, I mean, it would have gone very differently if Nick could roll a 9-inch charge. I would have lost it in the third turn myself. But I don't think that really as a whole that they had too much impact on my games. That's probably because I was using Morathi more offensively in this tournament. She wasn't actually sitting down and casting too many of the spells, and they weren't having too much of an impact. And then I think a lot of the Realmscape features that the events team chose just didn't affect my army at all. The first one, Clouds of Smoke and Stream, which is terrain features blocking line of sight, didn't affect me at all really. In fact, it was better for me because it stopped my opponents from. I mean, it meant that I could hide things. But yeah, I don't have much stuff that requires too much long range line of sight, so that didn't matter. Um, Life Springs is great because, as I say, that means that Marathi is staying alive for one extra turn. The Realm of Metal Shaman, I was really, really glad to not see Steel Rain in there. Because, yeah, as I say, having played Jimbo, he killed 21 witches in the first turn by just rolling a 6, and then killed 11 sisters in the third turn just by rolling a 6. And I think that ability, more than anything else in all of the realms, is just should not be in match play. Does have no place in match play. Just rolling a 6, it's just completely random. You have nothing that you can do against it, and it just affects certain armies, like units with only big units of hordes with the 6 up base save are just going to go down. Like just on the dice. I come to the table to play a game. Like I want to play a game. I don't want to just have that game decided by someone rolling a 6. And so I was really glad to not see that there. And then
it takes skill to roll 6s.
Not if you're Jimbo. Apparently, he was rolling them all over the shop. Yeah, but and then what are the other ones? Perpetual Dark in Orgu was limiting ranges of spells and abilities to 12, which again, unless Morathi is popping off double range spells, I don't have anything that's over 12 range. I don't even have a single ability in the whole army that is over 12 inches. Even the shooting from the Canary and the shooting from the Avatar is 12 and 10 respectively. And again, Better Part of Valor was just Realm of Death. That was +1 bravery for Eternal War, which is just neither here nor there. Doesn't affect anyone really. And then the last one they chose, Gleaming Vista, which is again no effect. It did seem like they were quite considered. I think their choices. Like I think the Realm of Shadow being in the Knife of Heart, and this is what I mean by this is the combination of scenario and Realmscape feature did seem quite considered on their part. I don't know whether it was, and they just rolled them randomly. It just happened that way. But I think the ability, the command ability from the Realm of Death, from the Realm of Shadow, allowing you to pop up on board edges is a really, really good combination for Knife to Heart, which is obviously quite a difficult scenario to win. To win the major,
it seems to me that they did put quite a bit of thought into this. So it was a way of making sure that realm rules were still a part of the game at the major showpiece Games Workshop match play event, but were used in a way that, as you say, would enhance the competitiveness of particular scenarios, like Knife to the Heart, or would be neutral. So you would get some flavour, but you're not going to get massive swings to particular armies, unless you're taking it
on the table for no reason.
Yeah, unless you were taking a gunline army. If you were taking a massively gunline army, you might be unhappy with Clouds of Smoke and Stream and Perpetual Dark.
Absolutely, yeah. Which I think there definitely were. Sorry, you're going to say, given that there's not much shooting in the meta, that didn't matter. Yeah. But I definitely did hear some stories of those really, really affecting games, and I think that seems to be the way with the Realmscape features. In general, like they can really, really affect one army and not another. And so I think, because of that, and unless they are carefully selected and probably should be published in advance, really, just turning up on the day and like finding out then that range is limited to 12 would really, really affect some armies. I think Rob described it the other day on Honest Wargamer as them essentially being comp, which I do kind of agree with there. And I think having, spoken to a lot of people over the course of the weekend, I think more people lost games because of Realmscape features than won them. And I don't know if that makes sense, because obviously if one person's lost, then the other person's won. And if it's because of the Realmscape feature that person's the other opponent has won because of the Realmscape feature, but you didn't hear people telling the stories of being like, oh, I won because of this Realmscape feature. You heard the people telling stories, oh, I lost because of this Realmscape feature.
There's a whole range of things in there. There's there's the sort of, people will more likely remember the negative experience. Like you'll be telling that Steel Rain story for years, I'm sure. In that people remember negative experiences rather than positive experiences. So I'm not surprised that people feel that way. But what you don't want is, you don't want to get to a table and feel that the table itself, rather than your opponent, has beaten you. You don't want to
Yes,
feel that
absolutely.
the
Yeah, absolutely. That's
terrain
a
or
good
the
point.
scenario that you're in has beaten you, um,
Yeah,
because you're just kind of like, I've been robbed by the rules. Um,
yeah,
the other thought I've got in terms of these is that, well, if you take the realm rules in match play as the way that they've been used at a lot of these events, which is we're going to use them, we're not going to announce them in advance, we're going to announce some in advance, but not all. So you've sort of got to keep the unknown. Then what they
mm,
are, as Rob's term of comp, but they're a way of going, well, I might have to deal with the fact that there's a number of things which could seriously skew a list. So I can't take a fully skewed list. So you've effectively got not self comp, but you've got to modify and go, okay, well, I can't take an extreme gunline list, or I can't take an extreme horde list. I can't take 200 giant
mm,
rats or whatever, because in if I am unlucky enough to hit this realmscape feature, then I'm going to be screwed. And if I want to win, I'm going to lose one game right out because of this. So therefore, I need to take a different list. Um,
yeah, yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah,
I'm really interested to see how this plays out over the course of a year, because you'll see how the player base changes in terms of whether it does affect that they write lists or whether or not people just grumble and then TOs drop realm rules or modify realm
yeah,
rules in such a way to try and take the edges off. So I'm interested to
yeah.
see how players in the scene deal with it.
Yeah, I think so, and I think at the moment probably the problem with round rules is that there hasn't been a decision amongst the community or as a whole that as to whether or not we're going to be using them going forward. They're not being used at some tournaments at all, and then they're being used in in limited ways at others. So I think that means that a lot of people haven't put the effort in to learn them all, and so I think that like it won't have it won't have been impacting people's list writing it as much as like you just mentioned that like people not taking gun lines because of cloud and smoke and stream or people not taking hordes because of steel rain. I don't think that would have made a much impact because I don't think that people know the rules anywhere near well enough yet. Like like
Yeah,
even
and
against some of
see,
the more carry on.
I've got no sympathy for if you go to an event and the event is going, well, right, we're going to use realm rules and this is all going to potentially be in play.
Yeah,
And if you then go and take a really skewed gunline list and you run into Clouds and Smoke and Stream or Perpetual Dark, and you then complain that you're not be able to shoot anything over 12 inches, well, that's your own fault for not having read the pack and considered it.
yeah,
Yes, okay, you
absolutely.
might have. I've got some sympathy if you've built up an army, you've got a lore and a narrative, and you've spent money and you invested, and it's your life's work, and you love the army and that sort of thing. So you don't have the flexibility and luxury to change. Look, I can understand that gives a negative experience, but if you're going there to win in a competitive match play and you haven't taken into account the pack and the rules that might be in play, then um, I don't have much sympathy.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
exactly. No, I agree. But it was just surprising how many sort of people didn't even know. Like I mean, guess most people had like little printouts of the spells or whatever. But like it was the command abilities. Like I remember in my game against Nick, one of his friends came over and he was like, "How have those witches got over there on the back of the board?" It's like, well, the command ability allows you to use this Ramscape feature, which allows you to teleport a unit 6 inches and then still move after it as well, stupidly. And he was like, "Oh, I didn't know that. I probably could have won my game because of that." And there's lots of moments like that, almost like got yous because
yeah.
people aren't putting the effort into to learn the realm rules. So maybe in 6 months' time, if we do decide to keep them and everybody knows them much better and they're considered a part of the game, then they could add something. But I think that the realmscape features need to be, as it appears they have been at the Warhammer World, they need to be pre-selected and they need to be considered because I just think that Steel Rain is just. I mean, obviously, I had a really bad experience with it, so I'm just going to keep moaning about that. But yeah, I just think like
Yeah. The
that and some of the
the
others just have no place in match play. Is my point.
yeah. One of the things that I said, and I'm gonna quote myself, one of the as an arrogant bastard, but the one of the things that I said when AOS 2 came out and Malign Sorcery was that once you start adding on layer of rules and options, what you then get is you then get a scenario where the very best competitive players will deal with those rules and maximize them to their advantage because they've read them, they prepared them, they know the rules, and as you all go scenario, they can take advantage of them. But that sort of next tier down, who might not be engaged with the rules, might not get to play as often, don't have the experience of it, it just comes as rules bloat because they haven't engaged with the rules enough to optimize them. And so it becomes either just bloat or it becomes a negative experience. So it's interesting to see the aspects of good generalship which changes the game changes. So I've got a good friend who he always used to reckon that he won games of Warhammer Fantasy Battle just on rules knowledge. That because he knew the minutiae of the rules in such great detail, he would find that he would have an advantage in particular scenarios. And we might be getting that way with the full realm rules, is that people who can have a solid grasp of the entire rule set now and all the various options within it can keep all those tactical options in mind so they can pull out the right card, as it were, when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think then, like, even again, to just use my game against Nick as an example, because I think the realm of Ulgu ability to teleport everything, any unit that's wholly within 6 inches of a board edge can teleport to another one. In that, I was really didn't know whether to take the first turn or the second turn because of that ability. But after his deployment, I could see that none of his units were all within 6 inches of the board edge, so I knew that he wasn't going to use that. And so then that influenced my decision to give him the first turn because I knew he couldn't use that there. Whereas I had set up a unit within 6 inches of the board edge, unit of 30 Sisters, to show him that I could do that. And like little sort of like little tactical plays like that, and knowing that rule before the game started allowed me to react and adapt to that. So I think, you're absolutely right. And then, I think there were so many stories of people who just wasn't even aware that was even a rule, and probably would have massively impacted their games. So I think it will eventually sort of really benefit the people who are learning those. And but then as you say, like most people talk about negative experiences. So if there's a lot of players who are going to tournaments who are just getting caught out by these rules, they're likely to be the ones who go online and complain on Facebook pages, and then probably affect the decision of whether realm rules get included in future editions or modified in certain ways. And but I think as a whole, it is too soon to say whether they have that much of an impact. I think we don't have enough data on that yet, really. And I think aspects of it can add to the fun, and aspects of it can take away from that, I think.
And that example of your game from Nick is a great illustration of how these rules come into play. I could spend hours talking about this kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
We were going to talk about where to sort of next for Daughters, and discussion of Daughters generally in the meta. Are we at peak Daughters? We've talked a bit about how Nagash is the sort of major threat. And I understand you're sort of going to go on Warhammer Weekly and talk about what next for Daughters. We might leave that for your discussion with Vince and Tom, so people can pick it up there. How about we round out the episode with a sort of discussion on sort of what's your future plans from here? Are you going to be sticking with Daughters? Are you going to try and get ahead of the meta again and pick something else? Or sort of what's the plans?
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with Daughters for the time being. Yeah, when I bought the army and kind of came up with the concept for it, I knew it was going to take me a long time to do, and like I'm really humbled to keep getting chosen for painting nominations at the tournaments I'm going to, because in my eyes the army is still only probably 75% complete. There's still a lot of painting that I need to do to it. And so, I knew that was going to be a year-long project, just in terms of the modelling and the painting and the amount of time that I wanted to put into that. Like, I'm sort of spending probably 2 to 3 hours painting every single witch, which I cannot do in a short time. So yeah, I want to finish painting this army first before I start moving on. I think I should have that done finally for Blood and Glory, and then I want to start coming up with the substitutes for Morathi. So I've got some ideas for conversions for warlocks and for snakes. I'd like to try everything within the army. I think at the beginning of the year, I was really sort of inspired by Byron's successes of last year of just playing the same list in and out and just getting to know it. And that was my decision then, or that affected my decision this year, that I wanted to just play one army and just get to know all of the units inside out. And so, I'll continue to do that, even if they nerf the hell out of Daughters in the FAQ at Christmas. And I'm sure someone will, maybe we can timestamp this to see whether I actually do continue to play them afterwards. But my plan is to definitely play them until at least Blood Tithe next year, which would be then a whole year of playing one army.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, as you mentioned, I'm going to be going on Warhammer Weekly next week to talk to Tom and Vince, who both play the army as well, and we're going to talk about, I guess, what next and the future for Daughters. So we'll get into it there. But I think there are a lot of lists outside of this one that can perform really well, and I guess it's sort of like now it's a game of anticipating the meta and where it's going, and kind of coming up with a new Daughters list to beat that. So I think definitely going to carry on playing them and expanding the sort of the Erstwood, the Age of the Erstwood. There's going to be lots of armies that I've got like at least 2 or 3 ideas for armies that are going to fit into this theme, and help to explore the narrative through the medium of army painting, I think. Yeah.
Right. I think you've truly demonstrated the textbook approach to success with an army. Pick an army with a relatively new book, write a list, play that list 40, 50 plus times, and then only then start considering substitutions of units and other things within the book based on actual play experience. It's the sort of it's not an easy way to success, but it's a sort of time-honoured, well-worn path to success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think for anyone who wants to get better at the game, like you learn way more about it than playing learn way more about the nuances of the game in general, playing just one list, game in, game out, than you will do playing 12 armies a year. Like I always get really frustrated at Nico because he takes a different army to every single tournament, and sometimes even a club game the other day, he bought 2 different armies to play in one night. He bought Stormcast and Ideneth and played 2 different games with 2 different armies. And I think Nico thinks so well about the game, and he's such a good player, but he just doesn't play the same army. And I think there's so much value in that. And so I think for anyone who wants to get better at the game, choose an army, choose a list, and just play that list. Don't make any changes until you really know whether or not that's the right change to make. And the only way you're going to know that is just playing games. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the. I seem to remember there was a famous Rick Priestley article in the sort of mid-90s in White Dwarf, which was how to. It was effectively write a list, paint the models, varnish them, name all the characters. Never change the list. Just continue to play.
Oh, okay, yeah, I know which one you mean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, it is. That's it. And I mean, I guess once it's said out loud, it seems obvious, but I think that's exactly it. Yeah.
It's hard to put in practice when you're chasing the new shiny or changes in the meta or other such things.
Exactly. Yeah. It takes a lot of willpower not to buy all these beautiful new models every time they come out.
Yeah. So talking about painting and finishing the Earthwood. So I understand you got some sort of developments on foot with the studio on the painting side of things. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit? Hey everyone, it's at about this point in the recording that we unfortunately ran into a few tech issues, so lost the rest of the recording from here. But what Ben goes on to announce is that he has just started, he's been doing it for a little while and it's going live in the next week or so, a commission painting service under the name Studio Erstwood. So based in London, covering commission painting services for a whole range of games. He's going to be putting up his website soon, and also possibly some new social media accounts. If you want to find Ben, you can find him down at the South London Legion, or on Twitter at the Erstwood. That's TheErstwood. The South London Legion, you can check out the club profile, which I had on aosshorts.com this week for all the details about the club. They play Wednesdays down in Croydon. As Ben said on Twitter, if you want a chance taking on his GT winning list and think you're hard enough, then come on down and give him a game at the South London Legion. For more on Ben and his recent successes, you can check out his upcoming shows on The Honest Wargamer with Rob, and with Warhammer Weekly, I understand, next week on sort of what's next for Daughters. So I highly recommend you check out both of those shows in general. In terms of final comments from me, I can only thank Ben again for coming onto the show and giving up his time. The extraordinary man of fashion, artist, chef, top tier tournament wargamer that he is. I think there was a lot of valuable insights in what he had to share. So hopefully it was something useful for you. So I just want to thank Ben again for his time on coming on. And the only last thing to mention is, as always, that I've got these partnership ongoing with Dark Fantastic Mills. So check out www.darkfantasticmills.com for great 3D printed terrain for Age of Sigmar and other war games. The stuff perfectly suits other fantasy games or settings like Warhammer 40,000. So wholly worth it. Highly recommend you check it out. Use the AOS Shorts discount code when you check out to get another 10% off the already low prices. So yeah, check it out. If you've got any questions, comments, feel free to feed it through to the site or to my Twitter at aos_shorts.com. Not .com, but at aos_shorts, or AOS Shorts on Facebook. Anyway, thank you very much, and bye for now. Cheers.